What Hitler said when Patton broke through at Bastogne. The snow fell thick and heavy that December morning in 1944, blanketing the Belgian countryside in an eerie silence. Inside a dimly lit bunker deep in the German Eifel Mountains, Adolf Hitler paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back. The wooden floorboards creaked under his weight. Outside, the wind howled through the frozen trees like a wounded animal. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Not now. Not when victory had been so close. Just days earlier, Hitler had been celebrating. His generals gathered around maps showing a massive bulge pushed into Allied lines. The Americans were surrounded, trapped, starving. The town of Bastogne sat like a prize waiting to be claimed, with thousands of American soldiers encircled by German forces. The Ardennes offensive, which history would later call the Battle of the Bulge, had caught the Allies completely by surprise. But now, a runner burst through the bunker door, snow still clinging to his uniform. His face was pale not just from the cold. He carried a message that would change everything. Hitler stopped pacing, his piercing gaze fixed on the young soldier who stood there, trembling. Not from fear of the Führer, but from what he'd witnessed on the roads leading to Bastogne. The runner's lips moved, forming words that seemed to stick in his throat before finally coming out. Mein Führer, General Patton has broken through. The room fell silent. Even the crackling of the fire in the stone fireplace seemed to quiet. Hitler's face remained expressionless for a moment, a mask of stone. Then something flickered across his features. Disbelief? Rage? Perhaps both. How was this possible? Patton's Third Army had been over 100 miles away, engaged on a completely different front. The weather had been so terrible that planes couldn't fly. Roads were buried under ice and snow. Military experts said it would take weeks, maybe months, to reposition an entire army under such conditions. But George S. Patton wasn't like other generals. To understand what happened next in that bunker, you need to know what had been unfolding across the frozen Belgian landscape. On December 16, 1944, Hitler had launched his last great gamble in the West. Over 200,000 German troops, thousands of tanks, and artillery pieces had smashed into a thinly defended section of the American line in the Ardennes forest. The attack was brilliant in its audacity. The Germans chose a time when the weather was so bad that Allied air power, their greatest advantage, was grounded. They struck at a quiet sector where inexperienced American units were stationed, soldiers who had never seen real combat. Within hours, the German spearheads had torn massive holes in the American defenses. Panic spread through Allied command. Some American units retreated in disorder. Others were surrounded before they even knew they were being attacked. By December 20th, the situation looked desperate. The town of Bastogne, a critical crossroads, was completely encircled by German forces. Inside, the 101st Airborne Division and attached units, about 18,000 men, prepared for a last stand. The German commander sent a message to the Americans demanding surrender. The acting American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, gave a one-word reply that would become legendary: nuts. But bravery alone doesn't win battles. The men in Bastogne were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The weather kept supply planes grounded. German artillery pounded them day and night. If help didn't arrive soon, they would be overrun. That's when Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower called an emergency meeting. All the top generals gathered to figure out how to respond. When Eisenhower asked who could counterattack to relieve Bastogne, the room fell silent. The logistics seemed impossible. It would require pulling multiple divisions out of active combat, turning them 90 degrees, marching them over 100 miles through the worst winter weather in decades, and attacking fresh German forces. Then Patton spoke up. "I can be there in 48 hours. The other generals thought Patton was insane or lying. What he proposed violated every principle of military logistics. An army isn't like a car you can just turn around. Tens of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of men, supply lines, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, all moving in coordination. In good weather, with proper planning, such a maneuver would take weeks. But Patton had already been planning. Days before the meeting, He'd sensed something was wrong in the Ardennes. He had quietly ordered his staff to draw up contingency plans for a rapid redeployment north. When Eisenhower gave the order, Patton was ready. What followed was one of the most remarkable military movements in history. Patton's Third Army, which had been fighting eastward toward Germany, executed a 90-degree pivot. In the middle of winter, under constant threat of German attack, with icy roads and blinding snowstorms, 3 entire divisions, over 130,000 men, along with their tanks, artillery, trucks, and supplies, began moving north. Military police stood at every crossroad, directing traffic. Units moved day and night. When vehicles broke down, they were pushed off the road and left behind. There was no time to stop. The soldiers didn't fully understand what was happening. They'd been fighting in one direction, and suddenly they were marching in another. Officers shouted orders. Sergeants pushed exhausted men forward. The cold was so intense that weapons froze. Men wrapped rags around their faces to protect against frostbite. But they kept moving. Back in Bastogne, the situation grew more desperate by the hour. German attacks intensified. Artillery fire never stopped. The wounded lay in makeshift hospitals in cellars, with medics operating by candlelight. Ammunition was rationed so strictly that soldiers were told not to fire unless they had a clear shot. On December 22nd, the weather briefly cleared, allowing supply planes to drop ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The parachutes drifting down looked like flowers blooming in the snow. It bought the defenders precious time, but everyone knew it wasn't enough. They needed an army, not just supplies. The German commanders knew this too. They threw everything they had at Bastogne, trying to crush it before relief could arrive. Inside Hitler's bunker, the mood had been triumphant for days. The Führer studied maps with his generals, moving pins and markers, discussing how they would split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. He spoke of how this victory would force the Americans and British to negotiate peace, allowing Germany to focus all its forces against the Soviet Union in the east. Hitler had dismissed warnings about Patton. His intelligence officers reported that the American general's forces were too far away, too heavily engaged, and the weather was too poor for rapid movement. It simply wasn't possible for Patton to disengage, reorganize, march over 100 miles, and launch an effective attack in less than a week. But Hitler had made a critical error. He'd based his calculations on what a normal general could do with a normal army. Patton was anything but normal. George Patton was 60 years old in December 1944, a career soldier who had studied warfare since childhood. He had an almost mystical belief in destiny and reincarnation, claiming he'd fought in previous lives as a Roman legionnaire and a Napoleonic soldier. His soldiers called him Old Blood and Guts. His superiors considered him both brilliant and impossible. His enemies feared him more than any other Allied commander. Patton drove his men harder than anyone thought possible. He personally traveled up and down the columns, his jeep flying his distinctive flag, shouting encouragement, demanding speed. When officers said something couldn't be done, he fired them and found someone who would try. He slept only a few hours each night, planning, coordinating, pushing. On December 22nd, the leading elements of Patton's Third Army made contact with German forces south of Bastogne. The attacks began immediately, despite exhaustion, despite the cold, despite facing veteran German troops in prepared positions. Patton's tanks and infantry hammered at the German lines, looking for a weak spot. The fighting south of Bastogne was brutal beyond imagination. The temperature dropped below zero. Snow and ice covered everything. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite as much as from enemy fire. Tanks struggled to move on frozen ground. Artillery crews had to warm their shells before firing or risk having them malfunction. The Germans fought desperately. They knew what breaking through to Bastogne would mean. Their entire offensive depended on capturing that town and its road junction. If Patton succeeded, the whole German plan would collapse. For 3 days and nights, the battle raged. Patton's men attacked again and again. The 4th Armored Division, leading the relief effort, fought its way mile by bloody mile toward Bastogne. German positions that couldn't be flanked were simply overrun by frontal assault. American casualties mounted, But Patton never slowed the pace. Inside Bastogne, the defenders heard the sound of battle getting closer. Artillery fire in the distance. The rumble of tanks. Radio messages became more frequent. "Hold on. We're coming." The men of the 101st Airborne, who had been fighting for 9 days straight, found new energy. They just had to hold a little longer. On December 26th, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, leading a task force of the 4th Armored Division, made the final push. His tanks rolled through snow-covered fields, trading fire with German anti-tank guns. Several tanks were knocked out. Infantry followed behind, clearing German positions. The fighting was close and vicious. At 4:45 p.m., Abrams's tanks broke through the last German line. They rolled into Bastogne's perimeter, and the siege was lifted. American soldiers who had been surrounded for 9 days cheered, shouted, and wept. Some were too exhausted to celebrate and simply collapsed where they stood. When Hitler received confirmation that Patton had broken through to Bastogne, his reaction was volcanic. According to officers present in the bunker, he erupted in a fury that terrified even his closest advisors. He screamed that his generals had failed him, that his intelligence officers were incompetent, that they had all underestimated the Americans. Hitler grabbed maps and threw them across the room. He demanded to know how this was possible. How had an entire American army moved so quickly? Why hadn't German forces stopped them? Why hadn't his generals anticipated this? The truth was painful and Hitler didn't want to hear it. The German army of late 1944 was not the unstoppable machine that had conquered most of Europe years earlier. Fuel was desperately short. Many tanks and vehicles ran on synthetic fuel that barely worked. Units were filled with teenagers and old men conscripted out of necessity. The Luftwaffe, once master of the skies, could barely put planes in the air. Meanwhile, the American war machine was at its peak. Factories back home produced endless streams of tanks, trucks, ammunition, and supplies. Every loss could be replaced. Every casualty could be reinforced. And commanders like Patton had learned hard lessons from years of combat. Hitler raged that Patton was his most dangerous enemy. He called him a cowboy general but said it with grudging respect. Hitler understood military history. He recognized what Patton had accomplished was extraordinary. Moving an entire army that distance, in that weather, in that time frame, and arriving ready to fight, represented a level of military excellence that few commanders in history had ever achieved. But Hitler's anger went beyond mere military failure. The breaking of the Bastogne siege meant his entire Ardennes offensive was doomed. Without capturing Bastogne, German forces couldn't effectively advance further west. The road network was too important. American forces would use Bastogne as a base to attack the flanks of the German penetration. Hitler ordered his generals to continue attacking. He refused to consider retreat. More German forces were thrown at Bastogne in desperate attempts to recapture it. But the momentum had shifted. More American divisions arrived every day. The weather began to clear, allowing Allied aircraft to dominate the skies. In the days following the relief of Bastogne, the reality of the situation became clear even to Hitler. His last great offensive in the West had failed. The attack that was supposed to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace had accomplished none of its objectives. Instead, Germany had lost thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, and over 100,000 men it could never replace. Patton didn't stop at breaking the siege. His Third Army continued attacking, pushing German forces back, cutting off entire units. The American general was famous for never giving the enemy time to recover. Attack, attack, attack. Keep them off balance. Destroy their will to resist. Hitler watched his Ardennes offensive collapse in real time. The Bulge pushed into Allied lines began to shrink. German units that had advanced 50 miles now retreated in disorder. Many soldiers, seeing the situation was hopeless, simply surrendered. The winter weather that had initially helped Germany now trapped its forces in a killing ground. Historians would later debate what Hitler actually said in those dark days after Bastogne. The bunker was deep underground with limited witnesses. Many records were destroyed in the final months of the war. But from survivor accounts and captured documents, we know Hitler's state of mind. He blamed everyone but himself. He blamed his generals for lacking initiative. He blamed the German people for not sacrificing enough. He blamed the weather for turning against him. But in private moments, according to some accounts, he acknowledged that Germany had lost the war. The relief of Bastogne became a turning point not just militarily but psychologically. American soldiers who had faced Germany's best troops in desperate circumstances and one felt invincible. German soldiers who had been promised one more great victory instead faced another defeat. The myth of German invincibility, already crumbling, shattered completely. George Patton visited Bastogne on December 30th, for days after the relief. He walked through streets still littered with the debris of battle. He saw the cellars where wounded men had been treated under impossible conditions. He met with the defenders who had held out against overwhelming odds. He awarded medals and shook hands. But Patton didn't celebrate long. In his mind, Bastogne was just another milestone on the road to Berlin. He immediately began planning the next offensive. His staff officers, exhausted from the previous week's efforts, looked at him in disbelief. Didn't he ever rest? Patton believed that the key to victory was never stopping. Never give the enemy a chance to regroup. Never let them dig in. Attack when they expect you to defend. Attack when they think you'll rest. Attack when conventional wisdom says it's impossible. This philosophy had carried him across France in the summer of 1944. In just 2 weeks after breaking out from Normandy, his Third Army had advanced across France faster than the Germans had retreated in 1940. He had liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, and destroyed more enemy units than any other Allied commander. The relief of Bastogne was Patton at his finest. Critics who called him reckless or accused him of caring more about glory than soldiers' lives missed the point. Patton understood that in war, audacity saves lives. A quick, bold stroke that ends a battle decisively costs fewer casualties than a cautious, prolonged campaign. The soldiers who died in his drive to Bastogne were a fraction of those who would have died if the siege had continued and the German offensive succeeded. Hitler understood this too, which made his defeat more bitter. He had gambled everything on one bold stroke, just as Patton often did. But Hitler's gamble was based on hope and delusion. Patton's was based on careful preparation, accurate intelligence, and realistic assessment of what his forces could accomplish. The Battle of the Bulge continued into January 1945. German forces fought desperately, knowing they were defending their homeland now. But the outcome was inevitable. The Ardennes offensive had been Germany's last reserves, its final card to play. When it failed, nothing stood between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany. Patton's Third Army pushed relentlessly eastward. They crossed into Germany itself in early 1945. Every town and village was a battlefield. German resistance stiffened as Allied forces approached the Rhine River, Germany's last great natural barrier. Back in his bunker, Hitler descended into fantasy. He moved divisions that no longer existed on maps. He planned counteroffensives with tanks that had no fuel. He issued orders to armies that had ceased to exist. His subordinates nodded and agreed, knowing the truth but afraid to speak it. The relief of Bastogne haunted Hitler's final months. It represented the moment when he knew, in his deepest thoughts, that Germany had lost. All the ranting, all the desperate orders, all the demands for miracle weapons and final victories couldn't change the fundamental fact that Germany was defeated. In his final testament, written just before his suicide in April 1945, Hitler blamed everyone for Germany's defeat. He blamed the Jews, the Communists, the Western Allies, the German people themselves. But in the long list of scapegoats, one name appeared more frequently than others: George Patton. Hitler called Patton the Allies' best general. He said that if Germany had had a dozen generals like Patton, the war would have ended differently. Coming from Hitler, who rarely praised enemy commanders, this was extraordinary. Patton never knew about Hitler's words. He died in December 1945, killed in a car accident in Germany after the war ended. Some conspiracy theories suggest he was assassinated, but most evidence points to a tragic accident. Either way, Patton didn't live to see how his relief of Bastogne would be remembered by history. Today, the relief of Bastogne is studied in military academies worldwide. It represents a masterclass in rapid deployment, offensive spirit, and leadership under pressure. What Patton accomplished in December 1944 is still considered one of the most impressive operational movements in military history. The soldiers who fought there, both American and German, never forgot. Bastogne became a symbol of American determination and resilience. The 101st Airborne's defense became legendary. Patton's relief force became the embodiment of the cavalry arriving just in time. For Hitler, Bastogne represented the death of his dreams. The Ardennes offensive was supposed to buy time, perhaps force a negotiated peace, at minimum delay the Allied advance. Instead, it accelerated Germany's collapse. The resources wasted in the Ardennes could have been used to defend Germany's borders. The troops lost could have fought delaying actions for months. When historians examine Hitler's final months, they often point to specific moments when reality crashed through the delusions. The relief of Bastogne was one such moment. Despite all his rage and denial, Hitler knew what it meant. The Americans he had dismissed as soft and weak had accomplished something extraordinary. They had moved faster, fought harder, and shown more determination than his own forces. The full scope of what Hitler said remains partially lost to history. Bunker witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Records were destroyed. The chaos of Germany's final months consumed many details. But we know from multiple sources that Hitler's reaction to Bastogne was one of his most intense emotional outbursts of the war. He reportedly told his generals that losing Bastogne was worse than losing a battle. It was losing the initiative, losing the psychological advantage, losing the belief that Germany could still win. When soldiers no longer believe victory is possible, defeat becomes inevitable. The snow that fell on Bastogne in December 1944 eventually melted. The soldiers who fought there went home or moved on to other battles. The town was rebuilt, but the memory of what happened there remained. For the Americans, it became a story of heroism and determination. The surrounded soldiers who refused to surrender. The general who did the impossible to save them. The civilians who endured occupation and battle. It became part of American military mythology, retold in books, films, and ceremonies. For the Germans, it represented the last moment when victory seemed possible and the first moment when defeat became certain. Veterans of the Ardennes offensive spoke of it with mixed feelings, pride in their fighting abilities mixed with sorrow at what might have been. Hitler never recovered psychologically from Bastogne. His health, already deteriorating, declined rapidly after the offensive failed. He aged visibly in the final months. Aides noted he shuffled rather than walked. His hands trembled. His eyes lost focus during meetings. The vitality that had driven him was gone.